of a package that we should recommend to the supervisors. We've been using $650 million as a target. In the past few meetings, it's been suggested that that may be high. The Board of Supervisors established a cap on the secondary property tax rate of 81.5 cents, so that the package that we submit cannot exceed 81.5 cents per $100 valuation, secondary property tax valuation. And I think we now have a much better idea of what that ceiling would be. Mr. Huckelberry distributed a memorandum based upon the most recent tax valuations. Chuck, do you want to walk us through that?
Yes, it's only 9 pages long, so I'm going to hit the highlights fairly quickly. Very often, and I think as I was walking out to go to a meeting that I couldn't, delay last week, I know the committee was talking about what's the cap, and I said, well, I'll get you the information as we kind of put it all together. And it caused me to actually go back and revisit all of the parameters and all of the issues related to bond indebtedness and our issues over the past years. And very often we hear a lot of negative, and we hear negative perhaps more often than we should, and that negative tends to generally influence our initial reaction. And after I got through with this memorandum, I fairly well concluded that some of my pessimism had been influenced by, negative discussion that frankly wasn't accurate. Let me kind of give you a little history. On the first page is typically, yes, we've always been operating under a cap that was approved by the board in 2004, and that cap is really to prevent surprises to taxpayers with regard to debt service. And that cap is a voluntary cap. It is not a constitutional cap. In other words, it's something that we impose on ourselves, and if we had to, in order to avoid default, that levy, that cap could be what it would be, but we've never ever exceeded it, and I don't plan in the future to do so. As you can see, we're down to 70 cents this fiscal year, been as low as 60 cents and as high as 78. If you then think of the parameters that we've always talked about in bonding, it's first, what's the term of the bond program? We've always said it's a 10-year program, and that's where we talk about retiring debt at $60 million a year or issuing it, and what you then get over 10 years, 60 times 10 is 600. So that's why we've always talked, 500 to 650. We've also had a very strict debt service retirement schedule, which means that we never issue bonds that have any life greater than 15 years. We've always done that, and that I believe has served us well. Based on the schedules, what occurs is the pay down of debt, and it's always been level, which means that we pay to an amortization schedule. We don't alter the schedule to say pay interest only first and then pay more principal later. It's always level debt service payments. So again, relatively conservative. We've done that, and we wouldn't recommend modifying that at all. And by doing so, 90% of your debt is paid back in the first 10 years. And the other factor that we thought was fairly important in how much indebtedness we could incur was the issue of the tax base. And we've been in this downward slide for 5 years. The tax base is readjusting to market conditions based on the recession that we are in and maybe now emerging from. And the question was, what was going to be our net assessed value, and was it going to be again negative for another year, 6 years in a row? Was it going to turn positive? Well, as you can see in my memorandum, it's turned slightly positive. We also forecast using our own economic models that it will be back up to about $8.7 billion in 5 years. That's below its peak, but it's still higher than what it is today at 8.6. Part of the negative discussions we've heard is the criticism of the county's bond debt. And we're a county that has chosen a path to capitalize and pay for capital improvements through bonded indebtedness and general obligation bonds. And so we get criticized as being the county with the most debt, and that's true. But our friends to the north are catching up fast. And as you look through this memorandum, we look at our history of bonding occurring over decades, not just simply the last few years. And we look over the 41 years that we've issued bonds, and and these are all, what's very important in this discussion, these are all voter approved. These aren't certificates of participation that are issued by other jurisdictions. They use that instrument mostly. We use it occasionally. But almost all of our debt is authorized by the voters, which means we go and ask the voters for permission. When you look at over those years, 2.064 billion in bonds have been issued. Paid back already is 1.275 billion. And we have outstanding debt of 693 million. Of that, 407 is general obligation bonds. And you can see the sewer revenue bonds and the PERF revenue bonds also in that equation. Again, those are being paid back today at about 10% a year. So in 10 years, that $693 million of debt will be down to only 4% of what it is today. So that's fairly aggressive repayment. And one of the things that I did as constructing this memorandum, I said to myself, well, if we're so concerned about the tax base today, what was the tax base when we had bond authorizations in the past? And if you look at the tax base during those periods on page 4 and table 2, you know, I was always a little concerned about $600 million of new debt and what we were going to do. So I went back and said, well, what was our tax base when we took the leap in 2004 to ask the voters for $583 million roughly of indebtedness? And our assessed value was $5.6 billion, almost $2 billion lower than what it is today. What we then did is we are under new statutes, and this occurs all the time, particularly in the area of bonded indebtedness disclosures and voter information pamphlets. If you turn to page 5 in my memo, what I've done is taken all of those parameters, the assessed value it is today, the 10-year program, the level debt service, 15-year amortization period, interest rates that we experience in the market today and will experience in the short-term market in the future, and then layered in debt, and you can see the sales, that's the debt, and so that's how you would issue debt if in fact there was a new authorization. What's interesting in this discussion is we have now included, and we will include in all of our future discussions, a statutory calculated net assessed value. What that is the Arizona statutes now say that in sending the voter a publicity pamphlet, here's how you calculate the net assessed value. You take the average of the last 10, and then you do this and you do that, and it's really an artificial measure. What I assume it was trying to do is that if in fact you had a wildly optimistic view of your growth and assessed value, you could make the apparent tax rate look lower. And so this has given us a very, very conservative future look at our tax base and our tax base growth. And it is upon that statutorily calculated assessed value that I've layered in that debt and calculated the actual tax rates. And you can see the tax rates, bump up to 80, the levy limit, not the levy limit, rate limit. And they stay there for a number of years, and then they begin to go down. Now, I've also, the next column over is the actual county forecast through our economic models dealing with what we believe the assessed value will be. And they start out fairly close in the early years, but by the time you get to the end, they diverge by 31%. And so what that tells you is that in reality, when we actually call for a tax rate in any 1 year of debt service, we will be using, the fourth column, not the third column, to actually set the rate. So the rates will actually be lower than they've been calculated based on using the third column. So that's, in essence, kind of a summary of what I've come up with that said that, yeah, let's not exceed $640 million is the number. And again, there's not a great deal of magic about that. As you can see, the variables that we're dealing with, but it is a, what I would call, very conservative estimate of what we could in fact do with the tax rates. If the committee were to approve and recommend to the board, and if the board were then to recommend to the voters, and if the voters agree to incur that amount of debt. I've also included a few tables that really are designed to help you with the issues of equity, and they deal with assessed value in the residential sector, the assessed value of the total by jurisdiction, and then finally, what I've given you is just simply a reminder that there are components of this bond proposal that are economic development related or tourism related that are generally trying to drive the economy faster than it's occurring today. And that's a good thing. But another good thing is that if you look at this array of $600+ million, if what has been generally postulated, and it will change, we know that, but it's going to create about $400 million of new construction. And then if you look at the construction jobs that are typically generated from that, that's also an economic driver that this community needs, particularly in the construction sector that remains relatively stagnant in the recovery. So with that, any questions, I'll be happy to answer.